There is a piece of information that emerged in the last 24 hours and that has not received anywhere near the attention it deserves. Today, April 17, Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi announced that the Strait of Hormuz is open to all shipping traffic. Read that again. The same strait where the United States Navy has deployed more than 10,000 personnel, a dozen warships, and dozens of aircraft to enforce a blockade since April 13. The same waterway through which 20 million barrels of oil flow every day, roughly 20% of all global seaborne energy supply. The same strait that US-Iran peace talks collapsed over 4 days ago in Islamabad. Iran says it is open. Washington says it is blockaded. And satellite imagery from the last 48 hours shows something that neither government is drawing attention to. China has erected a 352-meter floating barrier blocking the entrance to Scarborough Shoal, a disputed reef inside the Philippine Exclusive Economic Zone in the South China Sea, at the precise moment the Hormuz announcement broke. Take a moment to absorb what that actually means. Not China reacting to American pressure, not a coincidence of timing. What you are watching unfold in real time is a coordinated two-theater signal, and every analyst who is focused exclusively on Hormuz is missing the architecture of what Beijing is actually building. The economic stakes are not theoretical. Brent crude is trading at $102 a barrel, a 40% increase since this war began. WTI has crossed $104. The International Monetary Fund has already cut its 2026 global growth forecast to 3.1%, warning of an adverse scenario if oil remains above $100 through the summer. The US-enforced Hormuz blockade has deterred 13 ships in its first operational days. More than 34,000 vessels have diverted from the strait since the conflict began. The economic damage to Iran alone is estimated at $435 million per day. The broader global GDP cost of the closure runs to approximately $20 billion per day. But here is the number that nobody is quoting. Iranian crude oil that would otherwise command market rates is now flowing almost exclusively to Chinese state refiners at prices estimated $25 to $40 per barrel below Brent. On Iran's current export volumes of approximately 1.7 million barrels per day, that discount is worth between $42 million and $68 million per day. Flowing directly into China's industrial base, every single day the blockade holds. China is not a neutral bystander in the Hormuz crisis. China is being paid by the structure of the crisis itself to sustain it. Today, we are going to break this down the way it deserves to be broken down, with the actual numbers, the precise mechanisms, and the real consequences across every dimension. If you want to stay ahead of this situation as it develops, specifically as the May 14 Trump-Xi summit approaches, as China's weapons delivery to Iran either confirms or denies itself, and as Washington faces the first real test of whether it can sustain pressure across two theaters simultaneously, subscribe to Nexus Report now and activate all notifications. I am tracking every significant move in this story the moment it happens. The strategic architecture of what Beijing is constructing this week is the analysis this story demands. Hit that subscribe button and let's go through this completely. The first dimension is the Hormuz economic architecture, and specifically why this crisis is costing China almost nothing while it is costing everyone else enormously. When U.S. Naval Forces Central Command announced full implementation of the Hormuz blockade on April 15, the official framing was direct. Washington is enforcing free navigation, cutting off Iran's oil revenue, and demonstrating military commitment to its Gulf partners. The reality of the cost structure runs in the opposite direction of that framing. Iran exported approximately 1.71 million barrels per day in April. Before this conflict, Iranian crude sold to Chinese state refiners at discounts of $5 to $10 per barrel versus comparable Middle Eastern grades. Since the war began and all Western buyers exited entirely, That discount has widened to an estimated $25 to $40 because China is the only buyer with both the political willingness and the refinery infrastructure to process sanctioned Iranian crude at scale. At 1.7 million barrels per day against a conservative $40 discount, China is extracting approximately $68 million per day in value from this crisis. Every single day, the conflict continues. The United States, by contrast, is spending approximately $2 billion per month maintaining carrier strike group presence, patrol aircraft coverage, and 10,000 personnel in the region. The diplomatic capital spent managing Gulf ally concerns. The inflationary pressure from oil above $100 flowing directly into the American Consumer Price Index. For every day of Hormuz disruption, China profits. For every day of Hormuz disruption, the United States and the global economy absorbs the loss. The cost asymmetry is not a secondary feature of this crisis, it is the central mechanism. And here is the additional layer that most analysis is missing entirely. The Y-20 transport flights. On April 13, the day the blockade was declared fully operational, reports confirmed China had begun delivering to Iran through the CPEC corridor and Y-20 military transport aircraft. 5 HQ-9B long-range air defense batteries, 16 HQ, 16 medium-range systems, 24 HQ, 7 short-range batteries, 1,000 FN-6 shoulder-fired missiles, and 150 C-802 anti-ship missiles. These are not symbolic transfers. These are systems specifically designed to neutralize American air superiority over Iranian territory and threaten U.S. surface vessels in confined Gulf waters. China is extending the conflict's duration by filling the precise capability gaps that the U.S. air campaign created. For every dollar China spends on this weapons pipeline, it generates two outcomes simultaneously. It raises Iran's cost of capitulation, and it raises the cost to the United States of sustaining the campaign to force that capitulation. This is only part of the picture. The second dimension is what happened in the South China Sea, while every intelligence analysis was focused on the Strait of Hormuz. On April 10 and April 11 the same week, the Hormuz blockade was being finalized. Chinese maritime militia vessels erected a 352-meter floating barrier at the entrance to Scarborough Shoal. This is a disputed reef that sits 124 nautical miles from the Philippine coast, well within Manila's exclusive economic zone, and directly beneath the flight path of U.S. military aircraft operating from Clark Air Base and Subic Bay. 6 Chinese maritime militia vessels are now operating inside the shoal. 3 additional vessels are positioned outside, blocking the entrance. The imagery is confirmed by multiple satellite providers. The surface framing China is applying standard gray zone pressure in the South China Sea. Consistent with an ongoing pattern of incremental position building is technically accurate. But the timing is the mechanism. The United States has, this week, committed more than 10,000 military personnel and a significant carrier-level naval and air force package to the Persian Gulf. The same week, China moves additional vessels into a position 124 nautical miles from American partner territory in the Pacific. The same week that U.S.-Philippines joint exercises in Zambales are scheduled to begin the same province whose coastline faces Scarborough Shoal directly. Here lies the structural calculation at the center of what Beijing is executing. The United States cannot contest the Scarborough Shoal barrier with full credibility while maintaining carrier-level presence at Hormuz simultaneously. Every carrier strike group, every destroyer, every air wing committed to the Persian Gulf is a capability not available to Pacific Command. China has waited specifically, deliberately for this moment of American overextension. The historical parallel is precise. In 2014, Russia began the annexation of Crimea in the weeks immediately following the Sochi Winter Olympics, when Western political attention and diplomatic capital were entirely consumed by a different theater. Strategic opportunity is defined by adversary distraction. China is operating from the same analytical framework applied with considerably more economic leverage than Russia possessed in 2014. For every carrier battle group Washington commits to Hormuz, China's risk-adjusted cost to advance in the South China Sea declines. The mathematics across two simultaneous theaters are not competitive for the defending power. The third and deepest dimension is the May 14 summit and why China has constructed this specific pressure architecture to arrive at that table, holding the maximum possible leverage. Trump and Xi are scheduled to meet in Beijing on May 14 and 15. That summit was already complicated by the ongoing tariff structure. The current Section 301 investigations launched in March cover 14 trading partners simultaneously. The existing U.S. tariff regime amounts, according to the Tax Foundation, to an average $700 annual cost per American household and has not meaningfully reduced the trade deficit it was designed to address. Trump's explicit 50% tariff threat, issued April 12, stipulated that any country supplying weapons to Iran would face that rate on its exports to the United States. That threat was issued 4 days after U.S. intelligence had already confirmed Chinese delivery preparations were underway. The delivery began 1 day later. China's official position is stated clearly. China has never provided weapons to any party to the conflict. This denial exists alongside CPEC corridor logistics documentation, Y-20 transport flight tracking, and intelligence assessments from multiple agencies that have now confirmed the delivery sequence. The question is not whether China will deliver weapons. The delivery has already begun. The question is whether Washington can prove it publicly in a manner that forecloses the diplomatic deniability that Beijing requires to reach May 14 intact. This brings us to the mechanism that all of this leads to. What is actually driving China's decision calculus is not solidarity with Iran, it is not ideology, it is not even the value of the weapons deal itself. It is the summit. China has built a leverage portfolio in the last 30 days that is specific to the May 14 to 15 negotiating table. Consider precisely what Xi arrives at that summit able to offer or threaten: halt the weapons pipeline to Iran in exchange for concrete tariff concessions. Quiet the Scarborough pressure in exchange for semiconductor export control relief. Help broker an Iranian nuclear framework in exchange for a public statement of American respect for Chinese sovereignty claims in the Pacific. 3 pressure points. 3 potential concessions. 1 summit, 27 days away. The evidence for this interpretation is in the sequencing. The weapons deliveries began April 13, the day the Hormuz blockade was publicly declared fully operational. The Scarborough barrier was installed April 10 and 11 before the Islamabad peace talks collapsed on April 12. These moves were not reactions to American decisions. They were pre-positioned before those decisions became public. China knew the Islamabad talks would collapse. It knew the blockade was the logical American response. It moved accordingly and in advance. The media framing of this situation is that China is reacting to an escalating US-Iran confrontation. The mechanism is the inverse. China is setting the board for a negotiation that will happen in Beijing in 27 days. Every piece on that board has been placed deliberately. Why does analysis miss this? Because the dominant frame for Middle East coverage centers on Middle East actors: Iran, Israel, the Gulf states, the nuclear question. China appears in that frame as a peripheral actor with energy interests. The correction requires inverting the frame entirely. For Beijing, the Middle East crisis is not the story. The Middle East crisis is the lever, and the lever is being applied in the direction of a US-China negotiation, not an Iran resolution. For every dollar China spends delivering air defense systems to Iran, it generates approximately $15 in tariff concession leverage at the May summit. The mathematics are not competitive. Washington is paying full strategic price for a situation that Beijing constructed at wholesale cost. This scenario was not in Washington's operational planning. The administration has almost certainly not modeled the two-theater coordination adequately. Let us now examine, with genuine analytical precision, what happens across the three realistic scenarios playing out over the next 30 days. Scenario A, the most probable path, at approximately 60%, is controlled de-escalation, with China positioning itself as the indispensable broker. Today's announcement from Iran's foreign minister that the Strait of Hormuz is open to all shipping traffic is the opening move of this scenario. It is a tactical signal, not a structural resolution. It creates a diplomatic opening that allows the Trump administration to claim partial success on the blockade's stated objectives without requiring a full Iranian capitulation on the nuclear question that Tehran has consistently refused. In this scenario, China privately signals Washington in the coming days that it can influence Iranian cooperation on humanitarian and commercial shipping transit in exchange for a preliminary tariff adjustment before May 14. Trump accepts the framework as a win. Xi arrives in Beijing positioned as the actor who moved Iran. The summit produces a joint statement on trade framework and a quiet reduction in weapons delivery activity. The Scarborough barrier remains. China never agreed to remove it. It is treated as a separate issue under a separate negotiation track that Washington accepts because it has no bandwidth to contest it while managing the Gulf situation. The Iran war pauses but does not end. The nuclear question remains unresolved. China exits this 30-day period with reduced tariff exposure, an expanded South China Sea position that is now established infrastructure, and a demonstrated record of indispensability to any resolution of the Middle East crisis. The strategic gains are asymmetric and they are locked in. Scenario B, at 25% probability, is confirmed weapons delivery, triggering the 50% tariff and the collapse of the May summit. The tripwire is specific. U.S. intelligence publishes intercepts, satellite documentation, or CPEC corridor imagery that makes China's denial diplomatically untenable before May 14. Trump, facing bipartisan domestic pressure to act on the tariff threat he made publicly, implements the 50% rate on Chinese goods. Beijing announces a suspension of the summit. Retaliatory tariffs are applied to U.S. agricultural exports and Boeing orders. At this point, two dynamics accelerate simultaneously. China no longer has any incentive to moderate its South China Sea position. The Scarborough barrier becomes permanent infrastructure, the opening move of a longer-term control strategy for the shoal. Additional gray zone actions in the Philippine Sea follow, testing the depth of the U.S.-Philippines mutual defense commitment at a moment when Washington's military assets are concentrated elsewhere. And Iran, having received the full delivery of HQ-9B and C-802 systems, deploys them against U.S. carrier strike group operations in the Gulf. The blockade becomes significantly more expensive to maintain operationally and in terms of escalation risk. Oil remains above $100 through the summer. The Federal Reserve, already constrained by a 3.1% global growth environment, cannot cut rates into a commodity-driven inflation spiral. U.S. recession probability rises sharply. Watch the CPEC corridor. If additional Y-20 transport sorties confirm a second delivery sequence before April 25, the probability of this scenario rises from 25 to 35%. Scenario C at 15%, unlikely but structurally possible, is a comprehensive pre-summit agreement that diffuses the multi-front crisis simultaneously. In this scenario, the Trump administration makes a concrete offer on semiconductor export controls, specifically the AI chip restrictions that have been in place since 2022, and that constitute Beijing's single largest stated grievance in bilateral trade. In exchange, China provides documented evidence of a halt to weapons deliveries and applies direct pressure on Tehran to accept the nuclear framework that the Islamabad talks collapsed over. Iran accepts a modified agreement. The blockade lifts. The Scarborough barrier is quietly removed as a confidence-building measure. The May summit becomes a joint announcement of a framework deal that both leaders can characterize as a historic win. Why 15% and not higher? Because this scenario requires a level of institutional trust and communication depth between Washington and Beijing that does not currently exist. The back-channel infrastructure that historically allowed great powers to resolve this kind of multi-front crisis was systematically dismantled between 2018 and 2023. It has not been rebuilt. The Trump administration's preference for transactional bilateral deals does not map cleanly onto a bargain of this structural complexity. The scenario is possible. The institutional architecture required to execute it is not currently in place. What this situation reveals at its most fundamental level is something that students of foreign policy understand clearly, but that modern analysis consistently underestimates. The actor who defines the clock controls the outcome. China is not reacting to a crisis. China is managing a timeline to a negotiation. Every day that passes without resolution, without closing the weapons pipeline, without removing the Scarborough barrier, without resolving the nuclear question, is a day Beijing's position at the May 14 table improves. Washington is paying the carrying cost of an unresolved situation that China constructed and that China can close. The historical warning is exact. In 1956, during the Suez Crisis, the United States forced Britain and France to halt their military campaign in Egypt, not with military force, but by threatening to withhold IMF support that the British pound could not survive without. The most powerful actor in a crisis is rarely the one deploying the most force. It is the one who controls the exit. China today controls two exits simultaneously, the weapons pipeline into Iran and the South China Sea pressure valve. Washington needs both closed. Beijing holds both handles. Watch the CPEC corridor logistics and Y20 sortie frequency. Watch whether the May 14 summit date survives the next 2 weeks. Watch whether Tehran's Hormuz opening statement translates into actual commercial transit within 72 hours, or whether it was a signal aimed at Washington, not a policy directed at shipping companies. All sources are available in the description. Verify every figure for yourself. History does not repeat, but it rhymes, and the rhyme this week sounds precisely like every historical moment in which a dominant power stretched across two theaters it did not choose simultaneously, discovered that its adversary had been counting on exactly that stretch all along. The calculation was made in advance. The pieces were moved before the crisis broke into the open. And by the time the dominant power understood the full architecture of what had been constructed around it, the leverage had already been locked in. Those who cannot hear that rhyme are always surprised by what comes next.